things I just don't understand. The nearest star to the Earth is about 4 light years away. You know, can you understand what a light year is? I can't. It's how far light travels in a year. 186,000 miles per second. In a year's time, that's a long way. Well, as fast as that is, it still takes 4 years for a beam of light to get from a star down here. So whatever we see up there in that universe of stars, the closest one happened 4 years ago. If we see it today, it happened 4 years ago. I don't understand how that can be. Furthermore, it's 48 billion years for the furthest star, for the light of that star to ever reach Earth, so says the scientists. So I don't understand how that in Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth, took him 6 days, and yet it says he put the stars up there. And if it took 4 billion years for the light from the furthest star to reach the earth, how did the light get to the earth if he did it all in 6 days? I don't understand that. It's not necessary that I understand that. So I don't understand a lot of things, and I'm not sure I would have understood that sermon, that teaching about I come down from heaven. I am the bread of life. Moses had the manna. He came down from heaven. Manna, by the word manna just simply means, what is it? What is it? Jesus comes down from heaven and we say, who is he? Who is he? Jesus says, I am the bread of life. What does that mean? It means, he said, if you eat this flesh, you'll never die. So let's read on. Verse 54, Jesus still talking. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourself. You're hearing this for the first time now. Okay? You're listening to the sermon. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. And he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I am in him. The rest of that chapter there talks about the confusion that existed as Christ preached this lesson. And they said, this is pretty hard to get. They said, this is. And a lot of the disciples that were following him says that's too much, and they said, I'm not buying it. That's what they're saying. I'm not buying it. And so Jesus turns to his disciples, his closest, his chosen ones, and he said, "You're going to leave too?" And then those great words from Peter. He said, "Lord, where are we going to go? Who else is there? You're the Son of God." Did they understand that? I don't know, but they believed in Jesus. Why? Why? You know, it was like 500 years. There's no record of miracles up to the coming of Christ. John the Baptist, no miracles. Christ comes, and he performs that which no man can do. Now, I don't understand how he did it, but I believe he did it. And the reason I believe he did it is because if I were there, I could have seen it with my own eyes. And your eyes sometimes can deceive you, but when you see some of the things that Christ did, many of which are not even recorded in John, because John did not write about what Christ did. He wrote about who Christ was. And that was his whole point. Who was Christ? And he talks about some of the miracles. And if I had been there and I had seen the lame walk, been there for over 30 years, couldn't walk, been there almost his whole, couldn't walk, and all of a sudden he's up and walking around. Now you got my attention. Now I'm going to listen to what you got to say, because that's just not possible. What I just saw, that was a miracle. What we call a miracle. It's things man can't do, only God can do. That's a miracle. So now I'm going to listen. And so he says, eat this flesh and drink my blood, and you'll have life. And I got to think, wow, that's tough. And you won't know the answer to that until he's about ready to be crucified, and they have the Passover meal, and he tells them what it is. He said, this bread, that's my flesh. You see this wine? That's my blood. Okay. Now I understand what you're saying. It's not literally the blood, not literally the flesh. That's cannibalism. That's against the law. Aha. So it's a way of saying that I'm giving you my life, my body, my blood, and through that you'll have life, and you'll have life eternal. You know, I may have told you this, but in the New Testament, eternal life is mentioned 42 or 43 times. John mentions it, everlasting life, 17 of those times. Eternal life, eternal life, eternal life. 14 times in the book of John. Chapter 7. Anybody have any questions? Are you putting yourself there? We intellectually sit and read the Bible, and we're sitting this side of the cross, and we're looking back and saying, why do these people want to kill him? Why do they want to stone him? But if you put yourself in their shoes and you reflect upon what's going on, you have this tug of war about where did he come from? Who is this guy? And John is spending his whole writings about who Christ was. Now, in the 7th chapter, there's a feast. There are 3 times in the Jewish world. At that time, there were 3 times when there were what was called pilgrimage feasts. There is the Passover, there is Pentecost, and there's Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. All 3 of them go are tied together, but Sukkot was the word Sukkot means booth. It means that's where they commemorate and remember the Exodus and how the Jews lived in tents. during their time in the wilderness. And so it was a feast, one of the 3 feasts that had to be observed by faithful Jews, especially the men, had to make the journey to Jerusalem to have the feast. And so that feast came in like the latter part of the year. It was the fall of the year, September, October time frame. The Feast of Dedication, which was not a command, it came from the Maccabees when they restored the temple. When Antiochus, came and just desecrated the whole. He was being an interesting little story here, to me anyway. Antiochus was in Egypt, and there was a rumor started that he had died. And when he heard that rumor, he came back with just a furious attitude, and he attacked Jerusalem. 40-some thousand Jews were killed. 40-some thousand went into slavery, and he desecrated the temple to the point that he was sacrificing hogs on the altar and spreading the blood of the hogs around the temple, just desecrated. And then a fellow you probably remember, Maccabees, the Maccabean brothers. Their father, started a rebellion against that and cleaned out the temple, retook Jerusalem, and essentially refurbished the entire temple. And so that was called the Feast of Dedication. And that came in the latter part of the year. But this Sukkot was a feast for the Jews to remember how God took care of the children in the wilderness when they had to be fed from heaven with manna and had to live in tents, but they no longer were slaves to the Egyptians. Big celebration. It was a 7-day event, 7 days. Can you just imagine now if we had to all go to Jerusalem and spend 7 days, and in that 7 days you had to live here's what they did. The Jews would go out, and they still do it today, many of them. Cut branches off palm trees. And they use these branches to build them huts, and they sleep in these huts. As a matter of fact, one family I worked for were Jewish, and they came out of their house and they lived in temporary shelters for 7 days. But in this Jewish world, they would cut these palm leaves, and they'd come out of their houses. If they had a flat top roof, they would actually put the palm leaves up on the top, and they'd shelter underneath the leaves. And for 7 days, they would weave purple and gold threads around the palm leaves, and they would take those leaves to the temple, and they would go into the temple and go around the altar with these palm trees, and they would sing and they would rejoice about how God took care of his people when they could not possibly have survived in that wilderness. And and sacrifices made every day. I forget how many lambs and how many sacrifices were made, but it was a bunch of them. And then at the end, on the 7th day, there was a great rejoicing, a large celebration. And on that day, on that last day, they would go down to the Gihon Spring, and they would take the water, which was used in temple sacrifices and worship, and they would mix a little oil with it, and they would pour that on the altar, and then they would celebrate that life-giving water. And so when you look at Sukkot here in this chapter, it was a feast they had to go to. It was all of them, they had to go. But look what Jesus said. Look what he said now. he said to his brothers, because they were telling him, Jesus, you need to go because if you are who you say you are, people want to see. They want to see, they want to talk to you. You need to be there. Verse 4. Well, let's just go verse 1. After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Where would you have been? Which crowd would you have been in? Now the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, was near. Therefore his brothers said to him, "Leave here, go up to Judea, so that your disciples also may see your works which you're doing. For no one does anything in secret when he himself seeks to be known publicly. And if you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers were believing in him. Now, remember, if you were a Jew, it was one of the feasts, you had to go. Jesus said to them, "My time is not here yet, but your time is always opportune. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify of it, that its deeds are evil. You go up to the feast yourselves. I do not go up to this feast because my time has not yet fully come." Do you understand what he just said? What did he just tell his brothers? I know it's the law. I'm not going. They're going to kill. They're seeking to kill me. You ever think about that? I'm not going. Well, having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself went up, not publicly, but as in secret. A couple of weeks ago, or last week, I covered how that the lame man had been healed and how they responded about the fact that he was healed on the Sabbath. And that was against the rabbi's belief that you don't do any work on the Sabbath. That is a sin, and it says so in the law. There's just no work on the Sabbath. And so if you think you're going to convince us, the Jews would say, if you think you're going to convince us that you come down from heaven and you are special and you violate the law, you want us to believe you? You're going to violate the law? Or are you going to heal the man? Couldn't you just wait another day? And so Jesus now is back. It's about 6 months later. Because that event was quite a historic moment, and it was still being talked about. Now you're about 6 months later. Sukkot comes about 6 months after Passover, or after Pentecost. So now we've got a situation where Jesus has to respond. And here's what he says. By the way, in Isaiah 35, there is a passage about the fact that eyes will be opened. And like I said earlier, about 500 years now since the ending of the prophecies to the time of Christ was about 400 years, almost 500 years, and no miracles. And now, here's the situation. Verse 38. Christ is speaking. He who speaks from himself seeks his own glory. If you speak for yourself, your own glory. But he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he's true, and there is no unrighteousness in him. Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you carries out the law? Why do you seek to kill me? In their mind, they're saying, what do you mean we're not keeping the law? And then he says, does not the law tell you that on the 8th day, or on the, the circumcision was on the 8th day, was it not? The 8th day circumcision for a son. And if that 8th day falls on a Sabbath, which would happen, the Jews would circumcise the baby. Well, that was work. So, Jewish community, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep the law that says circumcise on the 8th day? Or the law that says keep the Sabbath holy? So the idea that you cannot do anything on the Sabbath, what was the whole point of the Sabbath? Was to rest, know that God rested, that he created all things, and he rested on that 7th day. So Jesus could have said, and he didn't, why don't you just circumcise them on the 9th day? Oh, that'd be a violation of the law. So there is a conflict. In their mind, Jesus is saying, which is greater? The life-changing event for a man who has been over 30 years, 37 years, I believe it was, crippled, unable to walk, can now pick up his blanket, his mat, his bed, and probably the only thing the man had in the whole life was that bed. He said, pick up your bed and walk. And when he did, what a turmoil was stirred up. Not because he could walk, but because he was told it was a Sabbath. So does grace override the law? Or was the law misunderstood by the Jews and fully understood by Christ? You see why I don't understand everything? So I count on you to talk to me after class and explain exactly what that means. One thing I believe is that Jesus had it right. Okay? Jesus had it right. And they could not answer. They could not answer. Jesus said to them, I did one deed, and you all marvel. And for this reason Moses has given you circumcision, not because it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And on the Sabbath you circumcise a man. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses would not be broken, are you angry with me because I made an entire man well on the Sabbath? Don't judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. And some people were listening to that and said, well, it kind of makes sense, okay? In verse 28, there's a word that's used there that I want to just talk about for just a second. It says, then Jesus cried out from the temple, teaching and saying, you both know me and know where I am from. I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me. When you read that the first words of that verse is, and Jesus cried out, there's a Greek word there. I don't pronounce krazos, K-R-A-Z-O, krazo. I looked it up. I don't speak Greek. I had to look all this up. It's interpreted as screaming or crying extremely loud. Same word, a similar word used on the cross. Jesus cried out, my God, my God. It was like a scream. That's a little side note there, but when he screamed on the cross, when he screamed out, there were sacrifices made in the morning and in the evening, around 3 or 4 o'clock, which is when Christ was crucified. And when that lamb, when the trumpet blowed, they would blow a trumpet off the temple wall to let everybody know that the sacrifice was being made, and the whole city would fall silent to remember that a sacrifice had been made for their sins. Started all the way back in the book of Genesis. Sacrifice, 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 all the way up. And so in the morning they'd blow it. In the evening they'd blow it. And in my mind, when Christ was on the cross and that trumpet blew, when he died and that city was silent, he screamed out, my God, why have you crucified me? And Jerusalem wasn't that big. I wouldn't be surprised if they could hear that all the way to the temple. That wouldn't surprise me. So when it says here, Jesus cried out, he wasn't just speaking with a loud voice. I think he was screaming it out to them. The city was not silent at this time. No trumpet had blown. Temple noise. I got 1 minute. First bell. He cried out, saying, you both know me and know where I'm from. I've not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. What did Christ mean when he was sent? And we'll see that later in this text. Christ said that he was sent, not like he decided that he had come. He says he was sent. He says, my Father sent me in another text we'll read here next week. Excuse me. John said in chapter 3, when he's talking to Nicodemus, listen to this. For God so loved the world. Catch it? God so loved the world that he sent his son. What he said, I was sent. So God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. I can't understand that. I try. It's like I started this class, there's just a lot of things I don't understand. Would I give one of my sons up for somebody in China or Africa or in a prison? A murderer? Would I give my son up? I can't get my head around it. But here I am, once a sinner, but now I'm a saint. Because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whosoever believeth in him will not perish, but have that word, everlasting life. You're all here because you're believers. I would pretty much conclude that you're all Christians. That means you're a saint. I'm going to tell you what a saint is next Sunday morning, Lord willing. A saint has no sin. Where'd your sin go? Where'd it go? We'll talk about that, Lord willing, next Sunday. Thank you for your attention.